Hi there, it's really great to have a chance to speak to you about a subject that's really close to my heart, which is sport, health and the environment. And it's wonderful, especially to do it in the context of your National Olympic Academy. I began my studies by looking at the Olympic movement and have spent the last 20 years going to each Olympic Games, summer and winter, to examine how technology is changing that world of elite sports competition, but in a broader sense, the world of elite sports production that operates around the athletes. And what's always fascinated me is the environment that surrounds athletic performance. And it's everything from the creation of scientific knowledge to the delivery of new technologies that are transforming not just what we know about athletic performance, but what athletes do, and how the media and all that ecosystem that operates around sports manages to deliver compelling, exciting, and really groundbreaking ways of envisaging performance, how we make sense of an athlete's abilities and even measure them as well. And actually the beginning for me when I started my PhD studies was to look at the relationship between sport and technology. So when I think about sport, health and the environment, there are lots of other concepts that come into play. My origins were in philosophy, and when you study a lot of the philosophy of technology literature, you begin to see connections between technology and the environment. In fact, if we look on a biological level, you could argue that anything that's external from our genetics counts as environment, and many people talk about epigenetic influences on our health, which requires us to look at not just our genes and how we come into the world and what genetic influences shape who we are, but everything that interacts with our genes as well. So when we want to understand our health, when we want to understand our cognition, what it is to be a thinking being within a body, we have to look at those environmental factors that influence our existence. So when we think about sport, health and the environment, these connections are so important and actually so partially understood, that our relationship between the inner workings of our mind, our biology and the external world is perhaps the most enduring conundrum for humanity to make sense of our place in the wider scale of things. It's a relationship that continues to elude us and in fact is evident by the way in which we operate within the world, how we treat the world, how we treat other species, how we treat the planet. All of these things are predicated on some fundamental assumption about our relationship to the wider environment in which we live. So if you think about that in a much more tangible, practical sense, which may be to do with our recognition of climate change or our treatment of other animals, it is always reliant on some notion of what matters to us versus what matters to the wider world in which we live. And it's only relatively recently, I would say probably since the 1960s, although you can see many of these ideas much further back in philosophical traditions that go back centuries, even millennia, that we cannot think about humanity as being separate from the world, from the ecosystem, from the planet at large, and from the overall sense of our planetary health that supports our own well-being. You begin to see these sorts of ideas emerge within many discussions about climate change at the moment, where many people are starting to think more widely about our place. But it becomes a problem because we are compelled into thinking about our interests versus the interests of others. And I use that in a very deliberately vague way because it is that relationship between us and them, our internal and the outside, which is at stake here. So when we think about sport, health and the environment, some very simple concepts come to mind. Concepts that are now popular, trendy or politically correct, that we should treat and respect other people, other animals, other species, and indeed respect the planet at large. But beyond these, what I would describe as sort of platitudes, recognitions of things that are seemingly obviously good, we need to really drill down into what that means. How should we respect the environment in a way that allows us both to fulfill our own interests, but also attend to the interest of others. And I'll give you one example. There's a man called John Lovelock who developed what's called Gaia theory. And one of the things that he said is that the planet is already well beyond the number of people it can sustain. So he had in mind the notion that planet Earth could sustain 2 billion people. Now we're at nearly 7 billion people now, so we're well beyond what he thought the planet could sustain. In fact, to achieve this optimum ecosystem balance, he felt 2 billion was the limit. So when you look now at the state of the world, bearing in mind that idea, you could absolutely argue that not only are we as a species far too successful in our progenation, the fact that we have too many of us, but also all the things that we do seem to be then further exacerbating the imbalance. So if you take sport as a great example, the sports world is reliant on hundreds of thousands of people, athletes, and all their people around them who travel across the world to compete in sports. And I would say probably since 1990, when we've had the Rio Earth Summit that talked about sustainability, and where we see the International Olympic Committee integrate sustainability aspirations and targets within its Olympic Games, which have also been criticised for being too much of an environmental impact to allow us to then ethically and responsibly decide that they can take place. Sport is, for many people, incompatible with sustainability. And it was interesting just this year in January at the Youth Olympic Games, which is a wonderful example of where new ideas are played out in the Olympic world. We had, at the time that the Youth Olympic Games was taking place in Lausanne, the Olympic capital, we also had a protest march that was led by Greta Thunberg in support of action for the climate. Now, you would imagine, given the IOC and the Olympic movement's commitment to the environment, this would be a good thing, that in fact we want the youth of the world to rise up and support these principles, but that fundamental tension that sports rely on thousands of athletes and all of their team members to go from one country to the next to compete in international qualifiers, national events, and so on, seems incompatible. So how should we think about this? How should we think about sport, health, and the environment, given these quite overarching themes in how we make sense of our world's development? It seems to me, especially at this really complicated year where we've had the COVID pandemic, many people are starting to reflect on how we operate, how we engage with the world, how we change habits. And a lot of my time is spent over the last few months, particularly looking at how sports have been delivered in the context of COVID. And of course, many of them have developed their own electronic versions of their sports and created events where people have competed virtually through computer games. There's a lot of work happening also in virtual reality systems that can simulate sport. So we can imagine a world where in the future athletes need not travel halfway across the world to take part in their sport. They could actually take part from their own environment. And I would say 5 years ago, maybe even last year, many people would have said this is ridiculous, this is impossible, we can't imagine this. In fact, there's something important about the physical space that we need to bring people together. But what we've seen over this period is, in fact, it can work really well. There is an appetite for it. And in fact, there's a way of staging competitions virtually that is really exciting. And some examples from the last few months have shown that, whether it's the Australian Grand Prix that took place in a computer game, or indeed the way in which the platform Zwift has become one of the most prolific computer-generated platforms for cycling events. And it was also at the IOC session earlier this year, again in Lausanne, during the Youth Olympic Games, where we had IOC President Thomas Bach say that this virtual sport of Zwift, where you are on your bicycle in your living room, cycling with it attached to a computer, generating an avatar, an image of yourself, where you're then competing alongside others within the computer game, and where spectators can see this, is not simulating sport. In fact, he said it is sport. So we see the beginnings of this now, where a world in which not just virtual sports can flourish, but where a whole range of other sports may emerge because of this interface. I think the world is beginning to see this as a realistic possibility. And what many people describe as the new normal is in fact more compatible with our commitment to the environment. So when we think about what sports can do to nurture our health, our environment, many of the things that we've learned over this 6-month period of lockdown and a whole range of limitations on what we can do have taught us about the importance of alternative ways of being physically active, of embracing ways of being engaged with sports that are less detrimental to the environment. So when we think about the future, to go right the way back to the start of my talk, which was to think about our genetics and the idea that for centuries we've tried to understand our health in a way that involves the observation of physiological indicators that tell us how we are, our temperature, our blood pressure. All of these indicators, markers of health, have now become so miniaturized by looking at the molecular level that we now understand that it's much more complex than we ever thought. So many of my colleagues working in science talk about we talk about the microbiome, the fact that we as a species don't just have our own genetics. We in fact have genes associated with the bacteria that we host that allows us then to understand more about our health. And if we want to make sense of our own capacities to be well, we have to understand those interactions. So the concept of environment, if we approach it from this very macro complex way, allows us to see why it's so important that we think about our relationship not just to others in the world, not just to other people, but to other species.
Okay, so that's the talk. I wanted to spend 3 minutes just summarising what I've said to be a springboard for your discussions. I wish I could be there to have them with you directly. But for me, there are 3 really important aspects of this topic. The relationship between sport, health and the environment is so important because it gets us to think about our relationship with the wider world. And so the environment isn't just about important issues like climate change and making sure that we treat the environment with respect and engage with it in a responsible way. It's much more about that fundamental, biological, almost nanotechnological, molecular level in which we make sense of the interactions between ourselves and the wider world. If we approach our understanding of the environment with that in mind, with a recognition that it's not just about our genes and their well-being, but the way in which they interact with other genes, other DNA, then we can come to, I think, at a point where we recognize not just how important it is to treat the planet well, but also how important it is to treat every species on the planet well. It's that relationship that we have to really grapple with to make sure that we can live in a healthy way, but also how we can make sure that the planet is healthy. So this notion of planetary health, I think, should underpin everything that we do, from the way in which we organise sports events to the way in which we think about business and travel and our relationship with each other. It goes down to a sort of very fundamental way in which we make sense of our place in the world. And having respect for the environment means taking a very long-term perspective on the future. It's not simply about employing technology to overcome the limitations of natural resources. It's about taking the best principles from nature and trying to integrate them into our way of being healthy, which is why I think if you look at the history of science, the more understanding we have about biology, the greater capacity we have to create technology that imitates and takes the best from biology and learns from it. All the innovations in science and technology at the moment are increasingly designing technology in a way that more closely resembles biological life. And I think that's where we can derive the greatest learning points. So if we want to be environmentally ethical, we have to first of all understand the relationship between nature and technology. Hope you have a great discussion. Look forward to seeing you hopefully some point in the future and talking about these matters with you in more depth. Bye.